The Tanya for the 6th day of Av, for Vav Av, is in the Igeres HaKedesh. It's Siman Beis, the second letter of the letters. This letter was written on the occasion of the Altarebe's release from imprisonment, in which he was arrested because of the accusations instigated by the opponents of Hasidus. It's on page 206. The number at the bottom of the page is 396. Igeres HaKedesh. Hacha biyosem Peterburg. After coming from Petersburg, from St. Petersburg, where we had been arrested. Siman Beis. Koteinti mikol achsodim umikol. The pasuk in Torah says, Yaakov said, when he was about to meet Esav, Yaakov said that he felt small from all the kindness that God had done for him, and therefore was worried whether he could succeed against Esav. And what this tells us is that every kindness that God does for a person, every time God shows us a kindness, he has to be extremely humble. The Mishnah says that a person should always be shval ruach. A person should always be humble before every man. Here the Altarebe says shval ruach b'ma'id. He has to be very humble. Why very humble? Because with each chesed he becomes more humble than he is ordinarily. So ordinarily a person should be humble. But with each kindness that God shows him, the person should become more humble. Ki chesed re'eh yemino. Because kindness is God's right arm, and we find that God's right arm is the source of kindness, as it says, v'yeminei techapkeni, that God embraces me with His right hand. Shehi b'chinas kirvas elikim mamish b'yeseseis milafani. And that means that God embraces us through His kindness, which means that every kindness brings us closer to God, closer than we were before. The closer we are to God and the higher we are, we need to be lower in our feelings about ourselves. We have to be more humble. So the closer one is to God, the greater should be the humility. As it says, God appeared to me from a distance. What does it mean from a distance? That from feeling small, from feeling far from God, that's when God appears for me. Or when God appears to me, then I feel far. I feel lowly and humble. And it says, all is before Him as nothing, which means that when you are before Him, and the closer you are to Him, the more nothing you feel. You feel yourself less significant. So the more you are before Him, He feels more humble, less of himself, and loses awareness of self. And this is the result of the right side of holiness. Holiness has a right side, and unholiness has a right side. In holiness, the right side, which is kindness, produces humility. The chesed li'Avraham, kindness of Avraham, which is the kindness of holiness, produces humility. Sha'amar anoichi ofer ve'efer. As Avraham said about himself, because of his closeness to God, I am dust and ashes. And this is also the midah of Yaakov, the attribute of Yaakov. And that's why he said, I have become small from all your kindness. I am humbled by God's kindness. And that was his explanation, his justification for being afraid of Esav, of his brother. and and it wasn't sufficient for him that God had promised him previously, I will be with you and I will protect you and I will bring you home and so on. And now all of a sudden Yaakov is afraid of Esav. Why wasn't he trusting? Why wasn't he depending on this blessing and promise that God had given him earlier? Because of the humility. Because Yaakov felt so insignificant in his own eyes. Because of the abundant kindness that God had shown him. Ki b'makli, etc. As Yaakov himself says, I crossed the river with only a walking stick, and now I am returning with a great wealth and a family and so on. And therefore, therefore I am no longer worthy of that original blessing to be saved from Esav. As the Gemara says, that he was afraid, Yaakov was afraid that he may not be deserving of the fulfillment of that blessing because of the sin. The sin may have interfered, may have gotten in the way of the blessing. Because it seemed to him that he had sinned. That's the degree of humility, where even though he hadn't sinned, yet he felt sinful, he felt a lack in himself. Whereas in the opposite of the holiness, which is the kindness of unholiness, hu Yishmael chesed klipa, which was represented by Yishmael, who was kindness in the unholy. Kol sha'chesed godel, there in the unholy, the greater the kindness is that God shows. Hu heilach v'godel begeva v'gasas haruach v'rechav libei. The more God shows him kindness, they become more arrogant and more important to themselves. And therefore, I want to make known for all Hasidim concerning all the kindness that God had made and had done wondrously for us, in that the Altarebe and Hasidus were both vindicated and freed and given the license to spread Hasidus and teach Hasidus throughout the country. There, in response to that kindness, the Altarebe calls on all Hasidim la'aches b'midesav shel Yaakov, to hold on to the attribute of Yaakov, to stick by the attribute of Yaakov, she'er amei she'eris Yisrael. The Jews who are called she'er amei, the remnants of the people. And one of the reasons they're called she'er is because she'meisem atzmei kishirayim u'meiseris mamish, because Jews are humble and consider themselves only a remnant, leftovers. She'ein beishum tzedech, leftovers because they don't have any great value. So this humility we must maintain, lebilti reim levava me'achehem, that their hearts, the hearts of the Chassidim, should not be haughty against their brothers. V'lei laharchev aleim peh, lisvek aleim chas v'sholem, and not to speak to them disparagingly, and not to whistle at them or hiss at them. In other words, not to treat them disrespectfully, even though they were responsible for the libels and for the accusations that led to the arrest of the Rebbe. And this was a very painful experience for the Rebbe. Yet the Altarebe says we have to be like Yaakov. The kindness, the victory that we have should not give us the license to look down at and to put down those who were responsible for it. Has melahaske be'azhara neira. It should be silenced and not mentioned, with a strong warning. Rak lahash b'lerucham v'libam b'midas emes liyankev. What Chassidim should do is humble themselves in their hearts, in the way that Yaakov does, mipnei kol adam, before all people, benemiches ruach, u'mayin rach meishiv chema, with a low humility of spirit, with a humble spirit, and with a soft response, which turns back the anger, v'ruach nicha, and with a restrained spirit, v'kul lahai v'ulai. And hopefully through all of this, Yiten Hashem belev achayim kemayim haponim, etc. May God grant that their hearts should respond as water reflects the face. In other words, those who had been the enemy, those who had been responsible for the Rebbe's arrest, should respond in the same way, just as water reflects back what you show to it. So if we show them a spirit of acceptance and a spirit of tolerance and humility, hopefully they will respond in the same way. The Rebbe points out that concerning Yaakov it says, Katenti mikol achsadim and mikol ha'emes. And in the opening verse of the letter, the Altarebe says, Katenti mikol achsadim u'mikol, etc., and doesn't add the word emes. And that's because when Yaakov said it, he was talking about the kindness that God had shown him in doing for him things that God had never even offered or promised, as well as that which God had promised. So the chesadim are those things that God did for him without promising. Umikol ha'emes, and from all the truth, meaning that God kept his word for those things that he had promised. Concerning the Altarebe himself, there had never been any promise. There had never been promised that he would succeed and that God would protect him and so on, that we know of. And so concerning the Altarebe, there was only chasadim, there was no emes in this case. And that's why the Altarebe leaves out the word emes. Another thing is that when Yaakov said that he felt that he had sinned or that he became smaller as a result of the kindness, how do we understand this concerning a tzaddik, concerning the Altarebe? Where was the smallness? What was the smallness? So the Rebbe explains that the Rebbe Rashab once said about the Altarebe that although it's difficult to say such a thing, yet it seems that the statement concerning the olive, that when you press the olive you get out good oil, that applies also to the Altarebe, that as a result of the pressing of the imprisonment and the suffering, the result was that we got out better oil, because after the release from prison, after Peterburg, the real spreading of Hasidus and bringing Hasidus down into understandable terms with lengthier Maimorim and better explanations and so on, began after Peterburg. So when we take a look at the analogy of the olive, an olive, before you press it, is a whole fruit. A whole fruit has a value over a broken or cut fruit. You make a bracha over the whole fruit, and so on. So the wholeness itself is a virtue. Once the olive has been pressed and you have the oil is a very valuable thing, especially olive oil. But at the time when it's being pressed, it is no longer a whole fruit. It no longer has the virtue of wholeness, and it hasn't yet produced its oil. So although it's a necessary and inevitable step to go from being an unpressed olive to producing oil, you have to go through the press. But there's a moment there in between when the olive is neither whole nor producing oil. And in the same way, the Altarebe before Peterburg taught Hasidus. And although it was in a brief form, but it was an intense form. After Peterburg, there was an increase, a radical increase of the spreading and the teachings of Hasidus. But during the time when the Rebbe was in prison, he wasn't teaching at all. And that's called the moment of smallness. By a tzaddik, even that is called, or appears to be, a sin, a lack of something. In the Hayom Yom for today, for the 6th day of Av, The Rebbe writes that the Altarebe, when he came back from Peterburg, he said for the Mittler Rebbe a very brief mimer of only a few lines. The mimer was, Se'u Yedechem Kodesh, raise up your hands, which means raise up the emotions represented by the hands so that they are closer to Meichen, to Seichel, and also bring the influence of Seichel to the hands. And when you do that, when you raise up the emotions and you bring Seichel to the emotions, then Uberchu es Hashem, which means that we bring down, Baruch or Bracha means to bring down, es Hashem, the name of Hashem, which we bring down the name of Hashem from the highest heavens down to earth. And through this, by bringing down the name Hashem, we then bring about Yevarechecha Hashem Mitzion, that we also bring down the godliness, the name of God as it is in Tzion, in the essence of the neshama. The essence of the neshama is called Tzion. And the result of that is Eisei Shamayim Va'aretz, that through this, the world, the heaven and earth, has a lasting existence. So, bringing Seichel to the Midas, or raising the Midas to Seichel, that brings the name of God into the world. When the name of God comes into the world, then the essence of the neshama is revealed, and when that happens, then the world's purpose is maintained, the world's existence is given, is justified, and the world is strengthened in its existence.